They say the heart wants what it wants, but what happens when what you want could destroy everything? I never imagined my life would spiral into chaos because of one fleeting glance. But then again, I'd never met anyone like him. It wasn't supposed to be like this. And he was my neighbor, a married man, a father, and I was just a kid fresh out of high school trying to figure out who I was. But when our eyes met for the first time, I knew I was in trouble. What I didn't know was how far this would go, how quickly I'd lose control, and how dangerously close we'd come to being caught. This is the story of how I risked everything for a man I couldn't have, and the one mistake that left us both with more than we could handle. Buckle up, because this ride is anything but smooth. The moving truck pulled up next door on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. I was lounging on the porch, sipping lemonade and scrolling through my phone, when the sound of heavy boots hitting the pavement caught my attention. I looked up and saw him. He was tall, with sun-kissed skin, and a body that looked like it belonged on a fitness magazine. His dark hair was messy, sticking to his forehead from the sweat glistening on his brow. He hoisted a heavy box onto his shoulder effortlessly, his fitted shirt clinging to every muscle. "Damn," I muttered under my breath, quickly averting my gaze when I realized I was staring. Behind him, a petite blonde woman climbed out of the truck, barking orders at the kids running around the yard. It was obvious she was his wife. My stomach sank as I realized he wasn't just hot. He was completely off limits. But even as I tried to look away, I couldn't stop myself from stealing glances. Great, I thought bitterly. A walking temptation just moved next door. Over the next few days, I couldn't help but notice him more and more. Whether he was mowing the lawn, fixing something in the garage, or playing catch with his kids, he was always there. And I was always watching. It didn't take long for my curiosity to turn into obsession. Every chance I got, I found myself at the window, peering through the blinds, waiting for him to appear. Little did I know, he was watching me too. It started as a harmless glance. At least, that's what I told myself. My bedroom window faced the house next door, and from the moment he moved in, I found myself drawn to it like a moth to a flame. At first it was innocent. I'd peek out the blinds while pretending to clean, or linger a little too long while watering the plants. But then I started noticing things. Small, intimate details that made my chest tighten. The way he wiped the sweat from his brow after mowing the lawn. How he laughed with his kids, and his voice deep and warm. How his shirt sometimes clung to him after a long day, hinting at the body beneath. It was all too much, and yet I couldn't look away. One night, as I lay on my bed staring at the ceiling, the bathroom light in his house flicked on. Out of habit, I turned my head, curious. There he was, standing shirtless in front of the mirror, his chest glistening with water droplets. My breath caught in my throat. He rubbed a towel over his hair, then turned toward the window and froze. Our eyes met. My stomach flipped as I realized he'd caught me. I ducked out of sight, my heart pounding so loud I was sure he could hear it through the walls. I stayed there, crouched by the bed, for what felt like an eternity. When I finally worked up the courage to peek again, he was gone. Relief and disappointment warred within me. I told myself it was just a coincidence. He couldn't possibly know I'd been watching. But then it happened again. And again. Each time, he left the bathroom light on just long enough for me to see. Each time, he seemed to linger, his movements slower, more deliberate. It was like he knew I was there, and he was putting on a show just for me. Days turned into weeks, and the tension between us grew thicker than I could handle. I became hyper-aware of every move he made, every glance he threw in my direction. It wasn't long before the inevitable happened. I was sitting on the porch, pretending to read a book, when he walked over to the fence that separated our yards. My heart leapt into my throat as he leaned on the wooden slats, his arms folded casually. "Hey," he said, his voice deep and smooth. "Hi," I managed to reply. I'm trying to keep my cool. "You've been spending a lot of time out here lately," he said, a small smirk tugging at his lips. "Enjoying the view?" My face burned, but before I could stammer out an excuse, he chuckled. "Relax, kid. I'm just messing with you. Listen, my wife's taking the kids out for the afternoon. I could use a hand moving some stuff in the garage. You free?" I knew I should say no. Every instinct screamed at me to stay away, to keep whatever this was from spiraling out of control. But the way he looked at me, with those piercing eyes and that mischievous grin, I couldn't resist. "Sure," I said, trying not to sound too eager. I followed him into his house, my heart hammering against my ribs. The air inside was cool and smelled faintly of his cologne. He led me to the garage, where a few boxes were stacked haphazardly. "I'm organizing some old stuff," he explained, though his tone suggested he wasn't really interested in the boxes. Figured an extra pair of hands couldn't hurt. I nodded, but as we worked side by side, the proximity became unbearable. I could feel the heat radiating off him, smell the faint musk of sweat on his skin. Every accidental brush of our hands sent sparks shooting through my body. Finally, he broke the silence. "You're not like most kids your age, are you?" he said, his voice low. I swallowed hard. "What do you mean?" He turned to face me, his eyes searching mine. "You're quiet, observant. I like that." His gaze dropped to my lips, and my breath hitched. The air in the garage felt thick, charged with a tension I couldn't escape. My pulse raced as he stood there, his eyes locked on mine. I couldn't tell if it was the heat of the day or the intensity of his stare that made me feel like I was melting. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words died in my throat. He stepped closer, the faint scent of his cologne mingling with the dusty aroma of the garage. "You've been watching me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but with a weight that made it impossible to deny. My heart sank, shame creeping in. I opened my mouth to protest, to make up some excuse, but he stopped me. "It's okay," he said, his lips curling into a soft, almost knowing smile. "I've been watching you too." My breath hitched, my head spinning with his confession. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. He was married, with a family. How could he say something like that? As much as I knew this was wrong, I couldn't deny the electricity in the air between us. He took another step closer, so close now that I could see the faint stubble on his jawline, the way his chest rose and fell with each breath. "If you want to go," he said softly, "you should leave now." But I didn't move. I couldn't. The way he looked at me, the way his voice wrapped around me like a warm blanket, it was impossible to resist. My heart pounded as he reached out, his fingers grazing my arm. His touch sent shivers down my spine, igniting something deep inside me that I couldn't ignore. And then it happened. He closed the distance between us, his lips capturing mine in a kiss that was both tender and desperate. My knees nearly buckled under the intensity of it, the way his hands cupped my face, pulling me closer. It was everything I'd ever dreamed of and more. Wild, passionate, and completely forbidden. One night, the light stayed on longer than usual. I couldn't resist the pull, couldn't stop myself from looking. He stood in front of the mirror, shirtless, his hand resting on the edge of the sink. His gaze shifted to the window, and I froze, my heart pounding. Then he smirked, a slow, deliberate smile that sent a shiver down my spine. He knew I was watching. He wanted me to watch. Late one afternoon, I was watering the plants in the front yard when his voice startled me. "Hey." I turned, the hose slipping from my hand as I saw him standing at the fence. He looked casual, leaning against the wooden slats, but there was an intensity in his eyes that made my breath catch. "Hi," I said, trying to sound normal, though my voice trembled slightly. He glanced over his shoulder, checking to make sure no one was nearby. Then he leaned closer. "I need to see you," he said, his voice low. "Tonight." I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. "Where?" "My place," he said. "Sarah's taking the kids to her sister's for the evening. Come around the back after dark." I nodded, unable to form words. He gave me a small, almost conspiratorial smile before straightening and walking away, leaving me standing there, my heart racing. That night, I waited until the house was dark and quiet before slipping out. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of freshly cut grass. I crept across the yard, my footsteps silent on the damp ground. When I reached the fence, I hesitated. The enormity of what I was about to do hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a stolen kiss or a lingering glance. This was crossing a line I could never come back from. But the thought of him, his touch, his voice, the way he looked at me, drove me forward. I climbed over the fence, landing softly on the other side. His back door was slightly ajar, the faint glow of a lamp spilling out onto the patio. I stepped inside, my heart pounding in my chest. He was waiting for me in the living room, leaning against the couch with his arms crossed. When he saw me, his expression softened, and he crossed the room in a few quick strides. His hands cupped my face, and before I could say anything, his lips were on mine. The intensity of that night was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't just physical, it was emotional, a connection that left me breathless and vulnerable in a way I hadn't expected. He held me like I was something precious, his touch both gentle and desperate, as if he couldn't bear to let go. We lay tangled together on the couch, the world outside forgotten. He told me things he'd never told anyone, confessions that made my chest ache with both sadness and longing. He spoke of the pressure to be the perfect husband, the perfect father, and how he'd spent his entire life burying parts of himself just to fit the mold. "I didn't mean for this to happen," he said softly, his fingers tracing patterns on my arm. "But I can't stop thinking about you. I've never felt like this before." His words were a double-edged sword, both thrilling and terrifying. I wanted to believe we could make this work, that what we had was worth the risk. But deep down, I knew the road ahead would be anything but easy. As dawn began to break, reality set in. "I should go," I whispered, my voice heavy with regret. He nodded, his eyes filled with a mix of longing and sadness. "Be careful," he said, pressing a soft kiss to my forehead. I slipped out the back door and climbed over the fence, my heart heavy with the weight of what we'd shared. But as my feet hit the ground on my side, I heard a sharp gasp. I turned, my blood running cold as I saw her, Sarah, standing on their porch, her face pale and her eyes wide with shock. The gasp was sharp and accusing, slicing through the quiet morning air like a knife. I froze, my heart plummeting into my stomach as I locked eyes with her. Sarah stood there on the porch, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her face a mixture of disbelief, fury, and heartbreak. I wanted to speak, to explain, but what could I possibly say? Is this some kind of joke? She demanded, her voice trembling. What the hell are you doing in my yard, climbing over my fence in the middle of the night? Evan appeared behind her, his expression darkening as he realized what was happening. Sarah, he started, his tone low and warning. Don't, she snapped, turning to him with fire in her eyes. Don't you dare try to explain this away, Evan. I'm not blind. I know what I just saw. Her gaze darted back to me, narrowing. And you? Do you have any idea what you're doing? What you're messing with? I swallowed hard, my throat dry and tight. Get inside, Evan said suddenly, stepping forward and placing himself between us. His voice was firm, commanding, and for a moment, I thought she might actually listen. But Sarah didn't back down. Instead, she laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. Inside? Really, Evan? That's your solution? Hide me away so you can keep sneaking around with him? She gestured toward me, her hand trembling. How long has this been going on? Or should I even bother asking? Evan's jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists at his sides. This isn't the time or place for this, he said evenly, though there was a hint of desperation in his voice. Let's talk about it later. Later? She repeated, incredulous. Are you kidding me? You've been lying to me, cheating on me, and you want me to wait until later to talk about it? I'm not lying anymore, he said quietly, his eyes meeting hers. The weight of his words seemed to hit her like a physical blow. She staggered back, her expression crumbling. You're not even going to deny it? She whispered, her voice breaking. You're just going to stand there and admit it. He didn't answer. The silence between them was deafening, filled with unspoken truths and shattered trust. I wanted to disappear, to run back into my house and pretend none of this was happening. But I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, a helpless witness to the devastation unfolding before me. Sarah's sobs cut through the tense silence, raw and heartbreaking. She turned away, her shoulders shaking as she tried to compose herself. Evan reached for her, but she flinched, stepping out of his reach. Don't touch me, she said sharply, her voice thick with tears. I can't even look at you right now. Sarah, please, he said softly, his voice filled with regret. I never wanted to hurt you. Then why did you do this? She demanded, whirling back to face him. Why, Evan? Was I not enough? Was our family not enough for you? It's not about that, he said, his tone pleading. This isn't about you or the kids. It's about me, about who I am. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. Who you are. Don't give me that crap, Evan. You're my husband. You're the father of my children. That's who you are. Or at least, that's who I thought you were. I've been living a lie, he said quietly, his voice heavy with emotion. I've been pretending to be someone I'm not for so long. I forgot what it felt like to be myself. And then his voice trailed off as he glanced at me, guilt and longing flashing in his eyes. Sarah followed his gaze, her expression hardening. And then you met him, she said, her voice dripping with bitterness. You threw away everything we had for some fling with the boy next door? It's not a fling, Evan said firmly. It's more than that. Her laughter was sharp and cold. More than that? You've known him for what? Weeks? Months? And you're willing to blow up our entire life for this? Evan opened his mouth to respond, but the sound of a car door slamming cut him off. All three of us turned to see the kids running up the driveway, their laughter breaking the tension like a hammer to glass. Sarah wiped her face quickly, plastering on a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mommy," one of them called, "we got ice cream." "That's great, sweetie," she said, her voice trembling slightly as she crouched to hug them. "Why don't you go inside and wash up?" The kids ran past us, oblivious to the storm brewing around them. Sarah straightened, her eyes blazing as she turned back to Evan. "This isn't over," she said coldly. "Not by a long shot." She shot me one last withering glance before disappearing into the house, leaving me and Evan standing in the aftermath. The weight of her words hung heavily in the air, a promise of the reckoning still to come. The silence between us was unbearable. Evan stood frozen, his gaze fixed on the door Sarah had disappeared through. His shoulders sagged, the weight of everything pressing down on him. I wanted to say something, to reach out and offer comfort, but words felt hollow, useless in the face of what had just happened. "I should go," I murmured, taking a step back toward the fence. My voice sounded foreign, shaky, and uncertain. Evan turned to me sharply, his eyes filled with a mixture of desperation and regret. "Wait," he said, his voice rough. He reached for me, his hand brushing mine for a fleeting moment before he pulled back, unsure. "Don't leave like this." "What am I supposed to do?" I whispered, my chest tightening with emotion. "I don't belong here, Evan. I never did." His face twisted with pain, and he took a step closer. "You belong with me," he said softly. "I don't regret this, any of it." I swallowed hard, the sincerity in his voice cutting through my doubts. But the image of Sarah's tear-streaked face flashed in my mind, a stark reminder of the chaos we'd caused. "It's not that simple," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Evan nodded slowly, his jaw tightening as he struggled to find the right words. "I know it's not," he admitted, "but I can't go back to pretending. Not now. Not after everything." I glanced toward the house, the light from the windows casting long shadows across the yard. "She's not going to forgive you," I said, my voice heavy with guilt. "And I'm not sure I can forgive myself." He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Instead, he reached out, his hand cupping my cheek gently. The warmth of his touch sent a shiver through me, and for a moment, I let myself lean into it, closing my eyes against the storm raging in my mind. "We'll figure this out," he said finally, his voice filled with quiet determination. "I won't let this be the end." The days that followed were a blur of tension and avoidance. I kept my distance both physically and emotionally, unsure of how to navigate the mess we'd created. Every time I saw Sarah or the kids outside, my stomach churned with guilt. I avoided the windows, the porch, anything that might bring me within their line of sight. Evan tried to reach out. Texts, calls, even a note slipped into my mailbox, but I couldn't bring myself to respond. Each message felt like a lifeline and an anchor all at once, pulling me back towards something I wasn't sure I could handle. One evening, as I sat alone in my room, my phone buzzed with another message from him. "We need to talk. Please." The simplicity of the words belied the weight they carried. My fingers hovered over the screen, torn between the urge to reply and the fear of what might happen if I did. Before I could decide, a knock at the door startled me. I froze, my heart pounding as I crept to the window. Evan stood on my porch, his hands shoved into his pockets, his expression tense and uncertain. I hesitated for a moment before opening the door. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "I couldn't wait any longer," he said, stepping closer. "You've been avoiding me." I crossed my arms, leaning against the door frame. "What did you expect, Evan? We blew up your life. Your family?" He winced at my words, but didn't back down. "I know," he said, "and I'm trying to fix it, but I can't do that without you." My resolve wavered under the intensity of his gaze. Despite everything, I couldn't deny the pull I felt toward him, the way his presence seemed to fill the emptiness I hadn't even realized was there. "Okay," I said finally, my voice barely audible. "Let's talk." Evan's voice was calm, but his words hit like a storm. "I told her everything," he said, his eyes fixed on the table between us. My chest tightened. "And she's hurt," he admitted, "but I couldn't keep lying. She needed to know." I nodded slowly, unsure of what to say. The weight of the truth hung between us, heavy and suffocating. "She's taken some time," he added. "I don't blame her. Neither did I. The consequences of what we'd done were unavoidable. And for the first time, I wondered if we'd gone too far." Days later, Sarah approached me in the yard. I braced myself, expecting anger, but her voice was quiet. "I don't hate you," she said simply. The words caught me off guard. "You don't?" She shook her head, though her eyes were heavy with sadness. "This isn't about you. It's about him. I just hope he knows what he's doing." I nodded, unable to find the words. She left before I could say anything else, her grace leaving me more conflicted than ever. Evan stood on my porch that evening, his expression soft but determined. "She's leaving with the kids for a while," he said. "We've agreed to figure things out separately." "And us?" I asked, my voice barely audible. He stepped closer, taking my hand. "I don't have all the answers," he admitted, "but I want to try, if you'll have me." In that moment, despite everything, I felt a fragile hope bloom. "I want to try too," I said softly. As he pulled me into his arms, I knew our story was far from over. It was just beginning. If you're hooked on this story and can't wait to see what happens next, make sure to follow the channel so you don't miss the continuation. There's so much more to unfold in Evan, Sarah, and our protagonists' lives, and I promise you won't want to miss it. Now, tell us, on a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate this story? Did you enjoy the twists, the characters, and this ending filled with possibilities? Drop your rating in the comments and let us know what stood out the most for you. And don't forget to like the video, share it with your friends, and turn on notifications so you'll be the first to catch our next stories. See you next time, and thanks for joining us on this journey.